Thanks very much, Sarah. Good afternoon, everybody. You've heard quite a lot already this afternoon about how important brain banking is, and what I'm hoping to do now is just give you some insight into what our experience has been in Edinburgh, where we've actually approached bereaved families at a crucial time and asked them how they would feel about making their deceased relatives' brain tissue available for research. Now, I think we've probably already covered most of this already, is why are we needing brains for research, and I think the other speakers have given you sufficient insight into that. We want to know more about different diseases, but as we've already heard, for that to go ahead, we also need control tissue to make the comparison with the diseased tissue. So if we look at the current sources of brain tissue that may be available for research, we do have the hospital post-mortem examination system, but the numbers, hospital PMs are declining and have been for a number of years now. There are neurosurgical biopsies, but again, the amount of tissue that would be available is restricted. We have the donor programs, which we've already heard about this afternoon as well, but again, they tend to concentrate on specific diseases. And we have the medical legal autopsy system, but the problem in that area is that these autopsies are not consented for research, which is absolutely crucial for us to be able to use that tissue. And the other potential difficulties when we look at the forensic service is that any approach to bereaved families is completely dependent on the Procurator Fiscal giving permission for that family to be approached. In the early days when we started out in our brain bank, the main concern from the legal side of things was over families being approached at such a distressing time. These families have been suddenly bereaved. We need to approach them very soon, usually 24 to 48 hours after the death of their relative, because the post-mortem is usually happening the following day. And the questions that arose were, is it appropriate for us to actually be cold calling these relatives and having this discussion, and is it insensitive for us to be doing that as well? And the other thing that we had to consider was that any removal of tissue samples at the time of post-mortem could not interfere with any defence autopsy or chain of evidence, depending on the type of death that had occurred. So I'll quickly run through exactly what the MRC Sudden Death Brain and Tissue Bank is and how it came to be. Basically, it was set up in Edinburgh in 2005. It's actually almost 6 years ago this month since we started out, and that was approved at the time by the Scottish Executive, Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, and also the Lothian Police Deaths Unit. This is a unit in Edinburgh that deals with all sudden deaths in the city. So they have a dedicated team that are in touch with these families who experience sudden deaths. The project was approved by the Research Committee in Lothian, and the main remit of the bank was to collect normal brain tissue from medical legal autopsies. And I think it is important to make you aware that it is not a donor programme. So we're not in the position to have people ringing up and saying, when I die, this is what I want to do. We completely manage, we're a very small team, and we completely manage the number of cases that we're able to offer this opportunity to. So the main aims when we started out in 2005 was to try and establish a way of actually gaining explicit authorisation from suddenly bereaved families. We needed to find out what support there would actually be. Were these families going to accept this? How were they going to take it? We had no idea what lay ahead. The plan was also that we would audit the family's experience of the authorisation process. So how we envisaged doing that, after much debate, we agreed that we would go back to relatives 6 months after the death of their relative and ask how they felt about the manner in which they've been approached and how they found the whole experience of being offered this opportunity to donate brain tissue for research at the time of autopsy. And what we hoped was that we would achieve significant numbers or sufficient numbers that we would be able to establish the sudden death brain and tissue bank. And I think the main challenges that faced us at that time was to actually develop a good way of approaching these families. There was no easy way to do it. We'd had a very short window, small window of opportunity where we could make that approach. We needed to be able to give these families the appropriate information, give them enough time to actually make a decision while not putting too much pressure on them, but bearing in mind that we really don't have very much time between speaking to them and the autopsy happening. And we needed to be sure that they had enough information so that they were actually making this informed decision. We also needed to establish good working relationships with everyone who was involved, and that the group of people that I've already mentioned, the police, the Procurator Fiscal Service, and also the staff at the City Mortuary in Edinburgh. So just to briefly explain how this works, the process of authorisation when someone dies suddenly in Edinburgh is that the pathology department receives a death report from the Procurator Fiscal. From that documentation, we can establish who the next of kin is, and that allows us to make a telephone call. What I should make everyone aware of is that when that full report comes through from the Procurator Fiscal, they have specified on that paperwork whether they allow me to approach a family or not. It's not rocket science, it's basically Tracy yes or Tracy no. It's very basic, but it's worked really well. So we can't do anything until we have that permission from the Procurator Fiscal. Then we're in a position to find out who the next of kin is and contact them by telephone. And as I say, it is a cold call. They're not expecting, a telephone call like this. So we usually have a short, I introduce myself, establish that they know what's going to happen, now that the relative has died suddenly. Usually they have some very basic questions about the process of events. I give them all the information, broach the subject of how they would feel about donating tissue that is going to be taken at the time of post-mortem anyway, and allowing that to be used for research. So when they've decided whether they want to go ahead with that or not, what happens is they receive a letter on that, sent out on that day, confirming what we've discussed and also what they've agreed to. Because although we take the verbal authorisation over the telephone, we don't get signed authorisation until a later date. So I always send out something confirming what we've discussed. As I've said, the forms go out usually about 3 to 4 weeks after the death of the relative, where the next of kin actually signs the forms, ticking the boxes, giving us full authorisation for research use of the tissue. When these forms come back, there's a final letter of thanks, goes to the family, and then the audit questionnaire is sent out 6 months later. So to date, the figures speak for themselves. We've approached 239 families and asked them how they would feel about making tissue that's taken at the time of post-mortem examination available for research, and 95% of these families have agreed to that. At the moment, we've had no families who have agreed to make the tissue available for research and then subsequently changed their mind and have withdrawn authorisation. On the tissue request side of things, we've now got 120 tissue requests that have been fulfilled, where researchers have basically accessed the tissue and they're using it for their own projects. In relation to the audit questionnaire, the results from that have been really positive. I think it's fair to say that when these results from the audit questionnaire come back, it's quite a nerve-wracking time for me, because it's basically an assessment of how I'm doing my job. However, so far we've sent out 133 and the response rate has been 57%, which probably isn't too bad for the type of information we're looking for. And I've just really summarised what people write on these questionnaires. None of them have reported that they felt pressured into making the tissue available for research. They've all remained satisfied with the decision they made initially. 6 months later, no one has said, well, I made that decision and now I wish I hadn't done it. And the vast majority tick the box saying that they think this opportunity should be made available to all bereaved families. I've put on that slide some comment. That's just some of the comments that people have either voiced during that initial telephone call, or they've written this on the audit questionnaire when it's come back. And certainly the first two quotes come from the mothers of 2 young people who committed suicide, and they found this particularly comforting and a positive experience, that despite what had happened, they were able to do something that may help other people. So in conclusion, I think what our experience has shown in Edinburgh, that despite the fact that it is a very distressing time for families, they have been suddenly bereaved, they are willing to actually authorise research activities on the samples that are taken at the time of post-mortem. The audit is suggesting that they're not further distressed by the request, and I think that was really important for us to know, because that was something I think that was possibly in the early days put in our way, that this may cause further distress. But what we found is actually that's not how people feel. We have found that people find this as something positive, and it's almost like the worst has happened, so nothing else can make it worse than what it already is. So they found the act of being able to do this a comfort. I think what we've also learned is that the public generally probably understand that medical research is required, and they're very keen to support that. That's the thing that nearly everyone writes on the audit questionnaire, is why, when I ask the question, why did you decide to participate in this? The reason they say is they want to do something that's going to help other people. It's also led to families voicing an interest in making their own research donation in the future. But as I said, at the moment, we don't have that in place. It's not a donor programme. We can't take names, keep people on file and assure them that when they die, they will be able to do this. And another interesting thing that we've found is that some families who refuse to donate tissue for transplant have actually agreed to authorise tissue for research in the context of forensic autopsy. That's it. Thank you.